Margaret liked to spend time in her garden. At 68, it was the place where she felt most at peace. After her husband Tom died 5 years ago, the garden became her main joy in life. Every morning she would wake up early, make a cup of tea, and go outside to check on her plants. Today was a warm spring day. The air smelled sweet with the scent of roses. Margaret wore her old straw hat to keep the sun off her face as she cut dead leaves from her favorite rosebush. Her hands moved with care even though they were not as strong as they used to be. She did not hear the gate open. She was too busy thinking about which plants needed water and which ones needed plant food. It was only when a shadow fell across her flowers that she looked up. "Grandma," said a young man's voice. Margaret turned and smiled. It was Thomas, her only grandson. At 24, he looked so much like her late husband that sometimes it made her heart hurt to see him. "Thomas, what a nice surprise," she said, pulling off her gardening gloves. "I wasn't expecting you until Sunday dinner." Thomas shifted from one foot to the other. His hands were deep in his pockets, and he looked nervous. Margaret knew her grandson well. Something was on his mind. "Would you like some iced tea?" she asked, starting to stand up. No. Stay there, Grandma. I'll sit with you." Thomas sat down on the small bench near the roses. He took a deep breath. "I have something to tell you." Margaret felt a small worry grow inside her. "Is everything all right? Your job? Your health?" Thomas smiled quickly. "Everything's fine. Great, actually." He paused, then the words came out in a rush. "I'm getting married." Margaret's eyes opened wide. "Married? But you're not even dating anyone. At least you haven't told me about anyone." The look on Thomas's face was a mix of happiness and guilt. "That's the thing, Grandma. I've been seeing someone for almost a year now. I wanted to tell you, but..." He stopped and looked at the fence that ran along the side of Margaret's garden. Margaret followed his gaze. On the other side of that fence was Harold Thompson's yard, Harold who had been her neighbor for 20 years. Harold, who she had not spoken more than 10 words to in all that time. Every year they fought over where the property line was. Every spring they tried to grow taller flowers than each other. They were famous in the neighborhood for their long-running feud. "What does Mr. Thompson have to do with this?" Margaret asked, though a cold feeling was growing in her stomach. Thomas took her hand. "Grandma, I'm going to marry Rose. Rose Thompson, Mr. Thompson's granddaughter." The pruning shears fell from Margaret's other hand and landed among the roses. The world seemed to stop for a moment. "His granddaughter?" she finally said. Her voice sounded far away to her own ears. "How? When? How did you even meet her?" "At the library last year. I didn't know who she was at first. By the time I found out, I was already falling in love with her." Thomas squeezed her hand. "She's wonderful, Grandma. You'll love her too, once you meet her." Margaret looked again at the tall fence. Behind it somewhere was Harold Thompson, the man she had argued with over every small thing for 2 decades. The man whose name could make her angry faster than anything else. And now their grandchildren wanted to get married. "Does he know?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Rose is telling him today too." He looked at her with hope in his eyes. "Please be happy for me, Grandma. I know about the feud, but that's between you and Mr. Thompson. Rose and I love each other." Margaret looked at her grandson's face and saw how much this meant to him, but all she could think about was Harold Thompson becoming family. The very idea made her feel dizzy. "Grandma? Are you okay? You look pale." Margaret picked up her shears from the ground. Her hands were shaking. "I think," she said slowly, "that I need that iced tea now." Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a glass of iced tea. Thomas sat across from her, watching her face with worried eyes. Neither of them had spoken for several minutes. "Grandma, please say something," Thomas finally said. Margaret took a sip of her tea. "I'm just surprised, that's all." She set the glass down carefully. "You've been seeing this girl for a year and never told me." Thomas looked down at his hands. "I was going to tell you. But then one day Rose mentioned her grandfather's name, and I knew right away who she was. After that, I was afraid to tell you." Margaret closed her eyes. The mention of Harold Thompson made old memories come back. Not the angry ones from their years as neighbors, but older ones. Memories she had locked away for so long that she almost believed they weren't real. "You don't know everything about Harold Thompson and me," she said softly. Thomas leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Margaret stood up and walked to a small drawer in her china cabinet. She opened it and took out an old, faded photo. She handed it to Thomas without a word. Thomas looked at the picture of two young people sitting on a park bench. They were smiling at each other, not at the camera. The young man had his arm around the young woman. "Is this?" Thomas began. "Me and Harold." "Yes," Margaret said. She sat back down heavily. "We were both 18. Thomas stared at the photo, then at his grandmother, his mouth open in shock. "You and Mr. Thompson were together? But how? When? Why didn't you ever say anything?" "It was a long time ago," Margaret said. She took the photo back and looked at it for a moment before continuing. "We met at the county fair the summer after high school. His family had just moved to town. We spent every day together that summer." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. What happened? Margaret's eyes grew sad. "His family didn't like me. My family didn't like him. Back then, people cared more about where you came from and who your parents were. His family was rich. Mine wasn't." She looked out the window toward the fence that divided her property from Harold's. "At the end of that summer, his family moved away suddenly. I got one letter from him saying he would come back for me. Then nothing." "And he did come back," Thomas said, beginning to understand. Margaret nodded. 15 years later. "By then, I was married to your grandfather. Harold was married too. He bought the house next door." Her voice grew harder. "He acted like he didn't even know me. Like what we had meant nothing. Did Grandpa know about you and Mr. Thompson?" "No, no one knew." Margaret sighed. "The first time Harold and I talked after he moved in, he was cold and formal, so I was cold back. Then he built that fence 2 feet onto my property. I complained. He ignored me. And that's how it's been for 20 years. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I had no idea." Margaret squeezed his hand. "How could you know?" "I never told anyone." She looked at him with sad eyes. "But now you want to marry his granddaughter. I love her, Grandma. She's nothing like what you've described about Mr. Thompson. She's kind and funny and smart." The phone rang, making them both jump. Thomas answered it. "Hello, oh hi Rose." His face grew concerned as he listened. "I see, yes. I told her too." "Ok. I'll be right there." He hung up and turned to Margaret. "That was Rose. She told her grandfather about us. She says he's very upset. She's crying." Thomas looked torn. "I need to go to her, Grandma." Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was angry that Harold was upset. What right did he have to be upset after what he'd done? But another part felt something else, something she didn't want to name. "Go to her," she said softly. "She needs you." After Thomas left, Margaret went back to her garden. She stood by the fence and wondered for the first time in many years what Harold Thompson was thinking on the other side. 3 days passed before Margaret heard from Thomas again. She spent most of that time in her garden, working harder than usual. The physical work helped keep her mind off the past and the complicated present. On the 4th day, her phone rang while she was making lunch. "Grandma, it's me," Thomas said when she answered. "I need to ask you something important." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. "What is it?" "Will you meet Rose? Just for coffee?" Thomas's voice was hopeful. "She really wants to meet you." Margaret's first thought was to say no. But she heard the worry in her grandson's voice. "Does her grandfather know about this?" "Yes. He's not happy about it, but he told Rose she can make her own choices." Thomas paused. "Please, Grandma, just one meeting." Margaret looked out her kitchen window at the tall fence between the properties. "Fine, one meeting." They agreed to meet the next day at a small cafe in town. Margaret arrived early and chose a table near the back. She was nervous, though she didn't want to admit it. The bell on the door rang, and Margaret looked up. Thomas walked in with a young woman. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The girl had the same eyes as Harold, the same deep blue that had once made Margaret's young heart race. "Grandma, this is Rose," Thomas said, his voice full of pride and love. "Rose, this is my grandmother, Margaret." Rose smiled and held out her hand. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. Thomas talks about you all the time." Margaret shook the girl's hand. "Please call me Margaret." She gestured for them to sit down. They ordered coffee, and at first, the conversation was stiff and formal. Margaret asked Rose about her job as a teacher. Rose asked about Margaret's garden. Thomas sat between them, looking from one to the other with hope in his eyes. Thomas tells me you grow the best roses in town, Rose said after a while. Her voice was warm and genuine. I've always loved roses, Margaret admitted. My mother taught me how to grow them. Rose's face lit up. My grandfather taught me. He has some beautiful old roses that he's been growing for decades. He says they're special but won't tell me why. Margaret's hand froze on her coffee cup. Could it be? No, impossible. What kind of roses? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. They're a deep red, almost purple in some lights. He calls them Margaret's Memories, Rose said. Isn't that a lovely name? Margaret couldn't speak. She remembered those roses. Harold had grown them from seeds the summer they were together. He had promised to name them after her someday. Thomas looked at his grandmother with concern. Are you okay, Grandma? Margaret took a deep breath. Yes, I'm fine, just surprised. She looked at Rose with new eyes. Your grandfather kept those roses all these years. Rose nodded. They're his prize flowers. He won't even enter them in competitions, says they're private. She tilted her head. Did you know my grandfather when you were younger? Before you were neighbors? Margaret hesitated, then decided on the truth. Yes, we knew each other briefly. She didn't say more, and Rose didn't push. As they continued talking, Margaret found herself warming to Rose. The girl was nothing like her stubborn, cold neighbor. She was open and kind, with a laugh that filled the room. She clearly adored Thomas, and Margaret could see that her grandson had chosen well. When it was time to leave, Rose surprised Margaret by hugging her. Thank you for meeting me, she said. It means so much to Thomas. And to me. Margaret found herself hugging back. You're welcome any time, she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. As they walked out of the cafe, Rose turned back. Would you like to see my grandfather's roses sometime? They're really beautiful. Before Margaret could answer, Thomas jumped in. Actually, I had an idea. What if we all had dinner together? At a restaurant, he added quickly, neutral ground. Margaret stared at her grandson. All of us, including Harold? Thomas nodded, his face serious. Rose and I are getting married. You two are going to be family. Maybe it's time to talk. Margaret thought about saying no. But then she remembered the name of Harold's roses. Margaret's Memories. After all these years. I'll think about it, she said at last. And for the first time she wondered what might happen if she and Harold finally spoke about the past. Margaret spent 3 days thinking about Thomas's dinner idea. She almost called him twice to say no, but each time she put the phone down without dialing. On the morning of the 4th day, she was in her garden when she heard voices from the other side of the fence. Grandpa, they're just flowers, a young woman said. That must be Rose. They are not just flowers, an older man's voice replied, Harold's voice. Margaret hadn't heard it in months. The garden needs to look perfect for the wedding photos. We don't need to take photos here, Rose said. We can use the park. Nonsense. This garden has the best light in town. Your grandmother would have wanted it this way. Margaret moved closer to the fence. She found a small hole between 2 boards and peered through. She could see Harold kneeling by a flower bed. Rose stood next to him, hands on her hips. Then why don't we use both gardens? Rose asked. Mrs. Wilson's roses are amazing. Thomas says they would make a beautiful background. Harold stopped digging. That won't work. Why not? Rose asked. The gardens are right next to each other. We could build a small path between them. Margaret backed away from the fence. A path between the gardens? That would mean taking down part of the fence. That would mean seeing Harold every day. The phone rang inside the house and Margaret hurried to answer it. Grandma, Thomas said when she picked up. Have you decided about dinner? Margaret took a deep breath. Yes, I'll go. Thomas sounded surprised but happy. Great. How about Friday at 7? I made a reservation at Tony's. That's fine, Margaret said. She hesitated, then added, I just heard Rose talking about a path between our gardens. Thomas was quiet for a moment. It was my idea, actually, for the wedding. We want to have it in both gardens, with the ceremony in the middle. But we haven't figured out how to make it work with the fence. The fence has been there for 20 years, Margaret said. Her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. I know, Thomas said gently. but maybe it's time for a change. After they hung up, Margaret went back to the garden. She stared at the tall fence for a long time. Then she went to her shed and got a hammer. It took her almost an hour to pull out the nails from one fence board. When she finally removed it, she saw a gap just big enough to step through. On the other side was a neat flower bed full of deep red roses, Harold's roses, Margaret's memories. She stepped through the gap before she could change her mind. She had never been in Harold's garden before. It was beautiful, with winding paths and carefully tended flower beds. Different from her own neat rows, but just as lovingly maintained. "What are you doing in my garden?" Margaret turned around. Harold stood a few feet away, holding a watering can. He looked older than she remembered, his hair fully white now, his face lined, but his eyes were the same deep blue. "I took down part of the fence," Margaret said, pointing to the gap. Harold looked at the missing board, then back at her. "Why?" Margaret wasn't sure what to say. "Our grandchildren want to get married in both gardens. They need a path." Harold set down the watering can. "Rose mentioned that. I told her it wouldn't work." "Why not?" Margaret asked, echoing Rose's question from earlier. Harold gestured around him. "Your garden is all straight lines in order. Mine is," he waved his hand vaguely. "Wild," Margaret finished for him. "But beautiful." Harold looked surprised. "You think so?" Margaret nodded. "I always have. I can see it from my upstairs window." She looked at the roses next to them. "Rose told me what you named these." Harold's face turned red. He looked away. "She shouldn't have." "Why did you keep them all these years?" Margaret asked. "Why name them after me if you were so angry?" Harold's shoulders dropped. "I was never angry at you, Margaret." Margaret felt her heart beat faster. "Then, why did you act like you didn't know me when you moved in? Why have we been fighting for 20 years? Harold finally looked at her. "Because it hurt too much to be your friend, to see you happy with someone else." He touched one of the roses gently. "I kept these to remember what might have been." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "All this time," she whispered. "All this wasted time." Harold took a step toward her. "Thomas called me about dinner on Friday." "I know," Margaret said. "I said yes." Harold smiled, a small, cautious smile. "So did I." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by Margaret's memories. "We should probably put the fence board back for now," Harold finally said. "Until we figure out what kind of path to build." Margaret nodded, "For now." She looked at his garden one more time before stepping back through the gap, but not for much longer. Friday evening came faster than Margaret expected. She spent an hour trying to decide what to wear before settling on a simple blue dress. She hadn't been this nervous about seeing someone in years. Thomas picked her up at 6:30. "You look nice, Grandma," he said with a smile. Margaret just nodded, not trusting her voice. The restaurant was only half full when they arrived. Rose was already there, sitting at a table near the back. Next to her was Harold, wearing a dark gray suit and looking as nervous as Margaret felt. "You made it," Rose said, standing up to hug Margaret. "I'm so glad." Harold stood too, but didn't come closer. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "Harold," she replied with a small nod. They all sat down. For a few minutes, no one seemed to know what to say. The waiter came and took their drink orders, which gave them something to do. "So," Thomas said finally, looking between his grandmother and Rose's grandfather. "Rose and I have been thinking about the wedding. We'd like to have it in August." "August is a good month for roses," Harold said, looking at his menu rather than at the people at the table. "That's what we thought," Rose said. "Both your gardens will be in full bloom." Margaret sipped her water. "Have you decided where exactly you want to have the ceremony?" Thomas and Rose exchanged a glance. "We were hoping," Thomas said carefully, "to have it right between your two gardens, where the fence is." Harold finally looked up. "That would mean taking down more of the fence." "Or all of it," Rose added. Her voice was hopeful but cautious. Margaret felt her heart beat faster. "All of it," she repeated. Thomas reached for her hand. "Grandma, the fence doesn't need to be there anymore. Not if you and Mr. Thompson can be friends." Margaret looked at Harold, who was watching her closely. "It would take some work," she said slowly. "There's 20 years of history there." "Some history goes back even further than that," Harold said quietly. There was a moment of silence. Then the waiter returned with their drinks and took their food orders. When he left, Rose spoke up. Grandpa has been showing me old photos from when he was young, she said. I found one of a girl who looks a lot like you, Mrs. Wilson. Harold gave his granddaughter a sharp look. Rose, that's enough. No, Margaret said, it's all right. She turned to Rose. Your grandfather and I knew each other a long time ago. Before we were neighbors. Before you were married to other people, Thomas added. Margaret stared at him in surprise. He shrugged. I put it together after what you told me. Rose's eyes widened. You two were together, like, together. Harold cleared his throat. It was a summer romance. A long time ago. But you kept the roses, Rose said to her grandfather. The ones you named after her. Harold's face turned red again. Yes. And you kept the photo of us, Margaret said, surprised. The one from the park bench. Harold nodded. I kept a lot of things. Thomas and Rose looked at each other with small smiles. Then Rose said, so, about the fence. If we take it down, Margaret said slowly, thinking it through, our gardens would become one large garden. That could work for the wedding, Harold admitted. But it would mean seeing each other. Every day. Would that be so bad? Thomas asked. Harold looked at Margaret. There was something in his eyes that made her feel young again. No, he said softly, it wouldn't be bad at all. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the restaurant's temperature. I think, she said carefully, that I could get used to seeing your wild garden next to my neat rows. Harold smiled, really smiled, for the first time that evening, and I could get used to seeing your straight lines bringing some order to my chaos. The food arrived, and as they ate, the conversation grew easier. They talked about the wedding, about flowers, about Thomas and Rose's plans for the future. When dessert came, Margaret found herself sitting closer to Harold than she had been at the start of the meal. Their hands rested on the table, not quite touching but only inches apart. As they were leaving the restaurant, Harold held the door for Margaret. Would you like to come see the roses tomorrow? He asked quietly, just for her to hear. In the daylight? Margaret nodded. I'd like that. She hesitated, then added, I'll bring my tools. We can start planning where to take the fence down first. Harold's smile was like the sun coming out. I'd like that too, he said. Very much. The next morning, Margaret woke up early. She took extra care with her appearance, putting on a nice shirt and pants that she didn't mind getting dirty in the garden. She ate breakfast slowly, watching the clock. Harold had said he would be waiting for her at 10. At 9:45, she gathered her garden tools and walked to the gap in the fence. Harold was already in his garden, kneeling by the rose bushes. He looked up when he heard her approaching. Good morning, he said, standing up and brushing dirt from his hands. I was just checking on the roses. Margaret stepped through the gap. They look wonderful, she said, looking at the deep red flowers. Up close, they were even more beautiful than she had imagined. They've always been strong, Harold said, even in bad weather. He gestured to a small table and chairs nearby. I made some iced tea, if you'd like some. They sat down with their drinks and looked out over the garden. From this angle, Margaret could see how the two properties fit together. Harold's winding paths and wild flowers on one side, her neat rows and organized beds on the other. Our grandchildren were right, she said after a while. This would make a beautiful place for a wedding. Harold nodded. It would. He looked at her. Do you really want to take down the fence? Margaret thought about it. I think I do, she said slowly. It's been there too long. Like a lot of things, Harold said quietly. They finished their tea in silence. Then Harold stood up. Let me show you around the garden properly. Harold's garden was bigger than Margaret had realized. In the center was a small pond with fish swimming in it. Around it were flowers of every color, growing in a way that looked wild but was clearly planned. This is where Rose wants to have the ceremony, Harold said, pointing to a flat area near the pond, with chairs set up facing the water. Margaret could see it in her mind. That would be lovely, she said, and we could use my patio for the reception. They spent the next hour walking through both gardens, making plans for where to remove the fence and how to connect the paths. By the time they were done, they had a clear idea of what needed to be done. It will take some work, Harold said as they stood by the gap in the fence, but I think we can have it ready by August. We'll need help, Margaret said. I'm not as strong as I used to be. Neither am I, Harold admitted with a small smile. But Thomas and Rose can help, and my neighbor on the other side has teenage sons who are always looking to earn extra money. Margaret nodded. It's a good plan. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind all morning. Harold, why did you act like you didn't know me when you moved in next door all those years ago? Harold's smile faded. He looked down at the ground. I thought you were happy, he said finally. With your husband, your family. I didn't want to complicate things. He looked up at her. And it hurts, seeing you with someone else. Even after all those years. I was happy, Margaret said softly. Tom was a good man. We had a good life. She took a deep breath. But I never forgot that summer, or you. Harold's eyes were full of emotion. I never forgot either. He reached out and gently touched her hand. I'm sorry for all the fighting over the years. It was easier to be angry than to be, whatever we could have been. Margaret turned her hand over and held his. It felt strange and familiar at the same time. We wasted a lot of time, she said. Harold squeezed her hand. Maybe, or maybe we weren't ready until now. They stood there for a long moment, holding hands across the border between their gardens. Then Margaret said, Would you like to come to my house for lunch? I made too much potato salad yesterday. Harold smiled, and it was like the sun coming out again. I'd like that very much. As they walked toward her house, Margaret realized that Thomas's shocking announcement in the garden had led to something she never expected, a second chance at a love she thought was lost forever. That evening, when Thomas called to ask how the garden planning was going, Margaret told him that the fence would be coming down sooner than expected. She could hear the smile in his voice when he said, I'm really happy for you, Grandma, both of you. Thank you, Margaret said, for everything. The summer days passed quickly as Margaret and Harold worked on their gardens. Every morning they met for coffee on her patio or his. Every afternoon they worked side by side, removing more of the fence, building new paths, and planning where the wedding guests would sit. It was strange how easily they fell into a rhythm together. Margaret found herself looking forward to seeing Harold each day. Sometimes when their hands touched as they passed tools back and forth, she felt like a young girl again. 1 week before the wedding, Thomas and Rose came to see the progress. The fence was completely gone now. In its place was a beautiful stone path that wound through both gardens, connecting them in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. It's perfect, Rose said, tears in her eyes as she looked around. Better than I ever imagined. Thomas put his arm around his grandmother. You two have done an amazing job, he said. I can't believe how different it looks. Margaret smiled. It's not just the gardens that are different, she said softly. That evening, after Thomas and Rose left, Margaret and Harold sat on his patio, watching the sunset. They were tired from a long day of setting up chairs and putting up small lights in the trees. This time next week they'll be married, Harold said, sipping his iced tea. Margaret nodded. They make a good couple. She glanced at Harold. They remind me of us, from that summer. Harold set down his glass. I've been thinking about that summer a lot lately. Me too, Margaret admitted. Harold reached into his pocket and took out a small, worn envelope. I found this when I was looking for old photos for Rose, he said, handing it to Margaret. I never sent it. Margaret opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter, dated just a few days after Harold's family had moved away all those years ago. The paper was yellow with age, but the writing was still clear. Dear Margaret, she read aloud, my parents told me we're not coming back. They don't approve of us being together, but I want you to know that I love you. I've never said those words to anyone before, and I may never say them again, but they're true. I love you, and someday, somehow, I will find my way back to you. Please wait for me. All my love, Harold. Margaret looked up, tears in her eyes. You never sent this. Harold shook his head. My parents found out I was writing to you. They took my letters. By the time I could send anything on my own, months had passed. I figured you had moved on. I waited, Margaret said softly. For almost a year, I waited for a letter, a call, anything. Harold reached across the table and took her hand. I'm sorry, for not trying harder, for giving up. Margaret squeezed his hand. We were young, and life took us in different directions. And now life has brought us back together, Harold said, through our grandchildren. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands as the sky turned from orange to purple to dark blue. Harold, Margaret said finally, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. What is it? After the wedding, when Thomas and Rose are gone on their honeymoon, she took a deep breath. Would you like to go to dinner with me? Just the two of us. Harold's face broke into a wide smile. Margaret Wilson, are you asking me on a date? Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. I guess I am. Harold brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I would be honored, he said. I've waited 50 years for that invitation. The day of the wedding was perfect. The sun shone brightly, making the flowers in both gardens look their best. Guests sat on white chairs arranged around the stone path. Thomas stood nervously by the pond, waiting for his bride. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed in her best blue dress. Harold sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. When the music started and Rose appeared, looking beautiful in her white dress, everyone stood. But Margaret's eyes weren't on the bride. She was looking at Harold, who was watching their grandchildren with tears in his eyes. It's a beautiful beginning, she whispered to him. Harold turned to her, his blue eyes full of emotion. Yes, he said, squeezing her hand, and so is ours. As Thomas and Rose said their vows, Margaret thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. How her grandson's shocking news in the garden had opened a door she thought was closed forever. How love could wait 50 years and still bloom again, like Harold's roses, strong and beautiful. I was in the garden when my grandson shocked me, she thought, and it was the best shock of my life.